when discussing the Kennedy campaign for presidency and the role of television, and you usually hear about the debates, of course. But another way of looking at the value of the use of television to promote his candidacy is, one I will remember just as a little boy. I mean, I'm living up in Duluth, Minnesota, which is hardly the mainstream of campaign row. And yet John Kennedy came to Duluth, Minnesota in 1960. And I knew enough about that and knew he was coming, and my mother, my brothers, and we all stood by the road and, watched the caravan of cars go by. So I was aware in Duluth, Minnesota, as a little kid, of this person running for the presidency. And we even we developed a jingle, I remember, as a 5-year-old, where we would just sort of sing, Kennedy, Kennedy is our man. Nixon belongs in the garbage can, which is great 5-year-old stuff. But even as a kid, a little kid, that's kind of interesting to have a kind of political awareness that had to have come, must have come from TV.
It started in July when the Democratic Party nominated Senator John F. Kennedy for President of the United States, and for Vice President, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. The party united behind its candidates. Richard M. Nixon was the choice of the Republican Party. He had served as Vice President of the United States since 1953. Now he was a candidate for the presidency. His vice presidential running mate, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge.
In the mid-50s, there's no question that for John Kennedy, what's going to be so much of his appeal is his youth. It's going to be the same thing for Richard Nixon. These are young men who have, represented this new generation coming out of World War II, and they're young. Nixon represents a certain kind of that young population. John Kennedy represents another flavor of that young generation. But the youth, the energy, the appearance of John Kennedy is going to have a tremendous impact, especially when you compare it, to the people that have been running the show. These are all older individuals. Dwight Eisenhower, very respected, older man. These are elderly individuals. This is a new generation, and John Kennedy is the face of that in so many ways. It's difficult for people nowadays to appreciate how primitive television was in 1960. It is a new medium. There aren't many channels. It goes off the air. Nightly news would be 15 minutes. It is an entirely different scenario. People are not that in tune to televisions. It's not part of their lives on a regular basis. There's just not much TV. But this is going to be the first election where we're going to start seeing more coverage. And part of that's going to stem from who we're dealing with, John Kennedy. He looks good on television. He's made for TV. And he's quite aware of that. Richard Nixon, even though he's in the same age group, is kind of an older, younger man. And he still sort of subscribes to sort of older, non-TV views. For example, he's much more of a sincerity politician. people will see that I'm sincere. People will recognize I mean what I'm saying, and I'm very devoted. And John Kennedy, yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean he's not devoted or he's less sincere, but he understands the medium better. It is one that appeals to looks and to style. And John Kennedy was preeminently stylish.
And I was a Republican back then. And I think maybe the party changed later, so I'm okay with that, but still. So I get this scholarship to go to Eagleton Institute of Practical Politics at Rutgers University and to study political science and practical stuff. And I'm so excited. And I get there, and there are 5 of us who are fellows, 4 Democrats and me. And it turns out, of course, that I have to defend Richard Nixon against John Kennedy in the election. And as the thing goes on, this becomes more and more difficult.
A lot of what we know today about Kennedy's opposition within the Democratic Party in the late 50s, early 60s was little known at the time. I mean, those are the kinds of old-time politics where you talk in the hallways or in the hotel rooms, or the houses of prominent people. But there's always been in the Democratic and in the Republican Party wings and flanks, and tend to be people more politically conservative or culturally liberal or economically liberal or whatever. A lot of the institutional Democrats, people from the 30s and 40s, the older school, they didn't look very favorably on John Kennedy. Many of them just saw him as kind of a pretty boy, who was just kind of wanting political office to, advance his status. And they didn't really see any track record that they respected. They didn't see any initiative on his part. And quite frankly, some of the things they saw in his congressional career offended them. His relationship with Senator McCarthy and his, very prominent opposition to communism, and not enough initiative with more liberal policies, the kinds of things that Eleanor Roosevelt made a career out of. So there's that famous snub when Eleanor Roosevelt commented on John Kennedy's book, Profile in Courage. She said, too much profile and not enough courage. I mean, that was a real stinging rebuke that was shared by many of her generation. And John had to kind of deal with that and work around it and get their support. I don't know that he ever really fully got it, but, he is a winner, and he would carry the Democratic banner nonetheless.
I suggested that if the United States felt that it could save the summit conference, that it would have been proper for us to have expressed regret. In my judgment, that statement has been distorted by Mr. Nixon and others in their debates around the country and in their discussions. Mr. Lodge on Meet the Press a month ago said if there was ever a case when we did not have law on our side, it was in the U-2 incident. The U-2 flights were proper from the point of view of protecting our security, but they were not in accordance with international law. And I said that I felt that rather than tell the lie which we told, rather than indicate that the flights would continue, in fact, I believe Mr. Nixon himself said on May 15th that the flights would continue, even though Mr. Herter testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that they had been canceled as of May 12th. But it would have been far better that if we had expressed regret, if that would have saved the summit, and if the summit is useful, and I believe it is. The point that is always left out is the fact that we expressed regrets to Castro this winter, that we expressed regrets, the Eisenhower administration expressed regrets for a flight over southern Russia in 1958. The Soviet Union in 1955 expressed regrets to us over the Bering Sea incident. The Chinese communists expressed regrets to us over a plane incident in 1956. That is the accepted procedure between nations. And my judgment is that we should follow the advice of Theodore Roosevelt. Be strong, maintain a strong position, but also speak softly. I believe that in those cases where international custom calls for the expression of a regret, if that would have kept the summit going, in my judgment, it was a proper action. It's not appeasement. It's not soft. I believe we should be stronger than we now are. I believe we should have a stronger military force. I believe we should increase our strength all over the world. But I don't confuse words with strength. In my judgment, if the summit was useful, if it would have brought us closer to peace, but rather than the lie that we told, which has been criticized by all responsible people afterwards, it would have been far better for us to follow the common diplomatic procedure of expressing regret and then try to move on.
You know, looking back on it today, what wasn't known at the time was much of that appearance was the derivative of medicine that he was taking that helped him have a tan, that gave him more flesh on his bones, that made him look more fit. On the other hand, too, I mean, we can't forget that Nixon was not well at the time he had been in the hospital. He wasn't particularly healthy at the time. He refused the kinds of things people said he should use, like more cosmetics. He didn't want that, and, you know, he didn't look the part. So television is going to be a new feature this time around.
I think if the president is responsible, if he consults with those involved, if he makes it clear that the Supreme Court decision is going to be carried out in a way that the Supreme Court planned with deliberate speed, then in my judgment, providing he's behind action, I believe we can make progress.
And I'll never forget the first debate when, you know, the famous Nixon looked terrible, Kennedy looked wonderful.
Now, Mr. Herter, in 1958, when he was Under Secretary of State, said they were strategically undefensible. Admiral Struance and Collins in 1955 said that we should not attempt to defend these islands in their conference in the Far East.
And, you know, the standard story, of course, and I don't know if there's any real empirical proof to back this up, but the standard idea is that, you know, if you listen to the debates, Nixon seemed to win on points. He seemed to be the stronger debater. And look, Nixon had lots of experience with that in college and from law school and whatnot. But if you saw it, you know, the image was greater for John Kennedy. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it seems to be the case.
I mean, I was really heavily involved in politics. I was a Republican delegate to the state convention before I was old enough to vote. I mean, I looked old. I always looked old. And nobody thought to ask me if I was old. So I just went ahead and did it, even though it was against the rules. So, I mean, I was in it. I ran for the legislature in '64, and it was, so, yeah, boy, I understood that I was on the tough side in that election, you know, to actually have to support Nixon when all this excitement is coming in on the other side. Wow, it was just really hard.
Many thought Kennedy was too young, including ex-President Harry S. Truman, who stated this belief publicly. Lyndon Johnson, along with Hubert Humphrey and Adlai Stevenson, the most likely Democratic presidential candidate that year, raised the question of Kennedy's health, a subject Kennedy was determined to keep hidden if he was to have any chance of occupying the White House. Only a week before the convention, Harry Truman complained that the convention was fixed and announced that he would give up his seat in the Missouri delegation as a result. He accused Kennedy of buying the nomination and of improperly pressuring delegates.
It's always a challenge for people to think historically. And it's just too easy to project now into the past and to think that what currently occurs or the attitudes or the climate of opinion was the same or similar, 20, 30 years ago. But 30 years is a long time. It's a generation. It's difficult for Americans today to realize the kind of division that was evident between Catholics and Protestants. And it's an age-old one in the United States for Catholics. a prejudice about the Pope, the prejudice about a foreign, Latin church in this country, and the suspicion or fear that if you're a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, that somehow you're going to be an agent for what the Pope would say. And that was a remarkable challenge that Kennedy had to confront and deal with. There are many people you talk to who lived during that time who are embarrassed to admit that they may have voted against Kennedy because of his Catholicism, and just fearful of that. I mean, we'd only had really one individual before run as a Catholic, and it's a tough one.
In a 1958 television interview, Eleanor Roosevelt accused Kennedy's father of having a paid representative in every state. And a few months later, touching on Kennedy's most vulnerable subject politically, his Catholicism, Roosevelt questioned Jack's ability to separate church from state. Kennedy confronted the sensitive issue of his Catholicism head-on at a September 1960 speech delivered to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association.
Do not judge me on the basis of these pamphlets and publications. We have all seen that carefully select quotations out of context from the statements of Catholic Church leaders, usually in other countries, frequently in other centuries, and rarely relevant to any situation here, and always omitting, of course, the statement of the American bishops in 1948, which strongly endorsed church-state separation, and which more nearly reflects the views of almost every American Catholic. I do not consider these other quotations binding upon my public acts. Why should you?
He's just not ready. He's too, he doesn't have the experience. He's too young. He's too, and he's Catholic, which was not a good thing in those days.
But let me say, with respect to other countries, that I am wholly opposed to the state being used by any religious group, Catholic or Protestant, to compel, prohibit, or prosecute the free exercise of any other religion. And that goes for any persecution at any time by anyone in any country. And I hope that you and I condemn with equal fervor those nations which deny their presidency to Protestants and those which deny it to Catholics. And rather than cite the misdeeds of those who differ, I would also cite the record of the Catholic Church in such nations as France and Ireland, and the independence of such statesmen as de Gaulle and Adenauer. But let me stress again that these are my views. For contrary to common newspaper usage, I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me.
The speech did much to allay the fears of a predominantly Protestant country. The rest of his campaign focused mostly on the perceived missile gap between the U.S. and Soviets, as well as the pressing domestic issues of the day, with an emphasis on getting the country moving again and connecting to the New Deal legacy to appease the liberals who had questioned his commitment. Election Day 1960 would start out with the two anxious candidates casting their votes, Vice President Nixon and his wife Pat in their hometown of Whittier, California. John and Jackie, while mobbed by photographers in Jack's hometown of Boston. Across the country, Americans showed up at the polls to vote for what would be destined to be a very tight race.
We get then to close to election night, and the people at Rutgers and at Eagleton got a connection with NBC News, and so all of us were allowed to go to NBC News on election night and to and to watch the election returns come in and participate in the coverage.
As with the debates, this would be the first election coverage where television would play a central role. The major networks competed to see who could present the most elaborate and, for the day, sophisticated methods and machines for tabulating results. Vast sets, full of bustling, busy people, were erected on sound stages that, within a few short years, would come to be the rule of the day.
There's a guy who was controversial head of NBC News. His name was Elmer Lauer. Really tiny guy. And all of us who are at Eagleton were kind of standing together, getting ready for the big night. And these doors burst open in this huge Studio 5. And then here comes Mr. Lauer and like 15 vice presidents or something in this phalanx. And all of us, we've read about this. We've heard about big business, but we didn't know. We never saw it before. They come stomping in. They all get together, and they help him up on a table. And he gives a speech about how this is, really important, and we got to do the best job possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he ended with a line I'll never forget. Was all famous to us the rest of the year, and that is, remember, doesn't matter if Kennedy wins, it doesn't matter if Nixon wins, it only matters if NBC wins.
The candidates' party headquarters featured large tally boards showing minute-by-minute results. After a slow start, with Vice President Nixon seeming to be ahead, as more results came in, the momentum tipped in Kennedy's favor. His supporters were elated. However, as the evening wore on, it became clear that the election would remain too close to call throughout the night, with the candidates seesawing back and forth. Finally, by the next morning, the papers would declare John Kennedy the victor. It would be the closest election since Woodrow Wilson, and before that, Abraham Lincoln. It would take until that afternoon for Vice President Nixon to finally concede.
I want to say that one of the great features of America is that we have political contests, that they are very hard fought, as this one is hard fought, and once the decision is made, we unite behind the man who is elected. I want all of you to know, I want Senator Kennedy to know, and I want all of you to know that certainly if this trend does continue and he does become our next president, that he will have my wholehearted support and yours too.
As he would throughout his presidency, Kennedy was careful to include his family in the spotlight. Once Nixon had finally conceded, Kennedy was able to address the country and his supporters.
To all Americans, I say that the next 4 years are going to be difficult and challenging years for us all. The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s. I ask your help in this effort, and I can assure you that every degree of mind and spirit that I possess will be devoted to the long-range interests of the United States and to the cause of freedom around the world. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
In what would come to be one of the closest elections in American history, Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon by 0.2% in the popular vote. It is no exaggeration to say that the 1960 presidential campaign forever transformed the landscape of American political campaigns.